Hello everyone, and welcome to the Watcher's Desk channel. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like if you enjoy the content. Today, we're going to be discussing the movie How the Grinch Stole Christmas from the year 2000. The small, snow-dusted town of Whoville, nestled snugly beneath the formidable Mount Crumpet, was utterly saturated in the effervescent spirit of Christmas. Their joy, a tangible force that seemed to vibrate in the very air, was an anomaly to the creature who observed it all with simmering disdain: the Grinch. Jim Carrey, whose physical comedy prowess honed in everything from Ace Ventura to The Mask, was perfectly suited for the contorted expressions of the cynical green protagonist, embodied this ultimate holiday hater. The Grinch, burdened by a past trauma, a youthful rejection stemming from his monstrous appearance that led him to flee human society, had cultivated a deep-seated resentment for the Who's relentless cheerfulness, and specifically, their clamorous celebrations. His life, isolated in his cavernous lair, was one of meticulous solitude, shared only with his loyal, if somewhat naive, dog, Max. Max, often the visual anchor of the Grinch's internal conflict, bore the brunt of his master's schemes. The catalyst for the Grinch's ultimate outrageous plan was Cindy Lou Who. This pint-sized dynamo, played by Taylor Momsen, possessed an innocent, almost ethereal belief in the true meaning of Christmas, a concept utterly foreign to the Grinch. Cindy Lou, catching the attention of the town's mayor, Augustus Mayhew, a man whose inflated ego mirrored his girth and who represented the worst of Whoville's materialistic excess, actually managed to glimpse the Grinch high on the mountain, prompting the creature's first real encounter with genuine, unvarnished kindness. This single act of goodwill only hardened the Grinch's resolve. He decided with theatrical fervor that if he could not find peace from their joy, he would simply eliminate the source. He would steal Christmas. The preparations were elaborate, demonstrating the Grinch's perverse, almost artistic commitment to villainy. He fashioned crude contraptions from salvaged materials, sketching out detailed blueprints that spoke to a mind capable of great focus, albeit directed toward malice. Utilizing Max, whom he comically fitted with a makeshift reindeer harness, a visual callback to classic holiday parodies, the Grinch descended upon Whoville on Christmas Eve. His transformation into a Santa Claus facsimile was as much a costume as it was a disguise, his performance mirroring the exaggerated enthusiasm he despised in others. What followed was a systematic, yet almost whimsical heist. He didn't just take presents. He took every single decoration, every garland, every last crumb of roast beast. The methodical nature of the theft suggested a choreographer directing a vast, silent ballet of disappearance. As he hauled his massive sacks of stolen goods up the slope, the anticipation of their ensuing misery was his only fuel. However, as the sun began to rise over Whoville, the Grinch anticipated the ensuing despair, the weeping, the wailing. Instead, a sound drifted up the mountain that stopped his calculated triumph dead in its tracks. It was singing. The Who's, despite waking up to an empty space where their holiday should have been, were gathered together, holding hands, their voices weaving a tapestry of enduring spirit. Cindy Lou Who's earlier encounter had somehow permeated the town's collective consciousness, revealing that Christmas, for them, was not about the stuff under the tree, but the connection between them. This realization struck the Grinch with the force of revelation. The heavy, icy ball that had long resided in his chest began tentatively to thaw. His own heart, once described as 2 sizes too small, visibly expanded. In an almost instantaneous reversal of his entire character arc, the Grinch abandoned his loot and rushed back down the mountain. The return journey was marked by an exhilarating rush of newfound altruism. He returned the gifts, mended the stolen decorations, and, most importantly, accepted the Who's genuine invitation. His appearance at the town square, stripped of his stolen facade, was met not with fear, but with open arms, spearheaded by Cindy Lou, whose unwavering belief in redemption. The final scenes depicted the Grinch participating, awkwardly at first, then genuinely, in the Whoville feast, finding, perhaps for the first time, a sense of belonging that transcended his need for cynical superiority. His acceptance into the community marked the ultimate defeat of his isolation, proving that even the most hardened cynic can be moved by simple, persistent goodness. The Grinch's initial descent into the town, cloaked in his makeshift Santa suit, was a masterclass in physical comedy, much like the best moments of Carrey's career, where the humor was inseparable from the pain etched on the character's face. He moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, his exaggerated smiles thin masks over the genuine fury churning inside him. Max, the beleaguered beagle, served as the perfect foil, his expressive eyes conveying the exhaustion and moral confusion of being an unwilling accomplice in such a grand act of sabotage. The dog's labored breathing under the burden of the sleigh often elicited a small, involuntary pang of sympathy from the viewer, highlighting the inherent unfairness the Grinch projected onto everyone, even his pet. The Who's themselves, in their vibrant, overly cheerful existence, represented everything the Grinch felt he was denied. Their homes were spectacles of excessive, almost blindingly bright ornamentation, embodying the very consumerism the Grinch perceived as the hollow core of the holiday. Augustus Mayhew, the mayor, stood as the apotheosis of this materialism. He was a caricature of self-importance, a man whose public pronouncements on Christmas spirit rang utterly false against the backdrop of his own petty maneuvering to maintain social dominance. It was Mayhew's previous public dismissal of the Grinch in his youth, a moment that cemented the Grinch's exile, that provided the deepest root for the resentment that now fueled the sleigh ride. Cindy Lou Who, however, introduced an element of pure, untainted grace into this highly charged emotional landscape. Her belief in the Grinch, born from that brief, accidental kindness on the mountain path, was not naive as much as it was radically empathetic. When she caught him, she didn't immediately recoil. She offered him something, a moment of connection, which the Grinch's trauma immediately interpreted as a threat or a trick. Yet that offering remained, a seed planted in the frozen earth of his heart. The climax atop Mount Crumpet, as the Grinch prepared to send the entire hall tumbling into the abyss, was fraught with tension derived not from the danger to the presents, but from the suspense over the Grinch's final psychological break. When the singing began, the sound was described by the narrative as a physical wave washing over him. It was the sound of community defying absence. The Grinch, expecting the cacophony of heartbreak, was met instead with harmony. This realization that the Who's possessed an inner light that could not be stolen by pilfering objects forced an immediate confrontation with his own carefully constructed reality. His heart, which had been a cold, hard mechanism of spite, didn't just warm, it seemed to physically reject its former constraints, perhaps mirroring the explosive growth required for true emotional change. The descent back into Whoville was characterized by a frantic, almost panicked need for atonement. The Grinch was shedding his villainous persona like an ill-fitting suit. When he reappeared in the town square, the silence was profound, not of terror, but of stunned recognition. His offering of the roast beast, his participation in the subsequent celebration, signaled a profound surrender, not to defeat, but to belonging. He was welcomed into the circle, his sharp edges sanded down by the collective warmth, finally understanding that the joy he had so vehemently opposed was not something external to be envied, but an internal state to be shared. The act of the Grinch returning the loot was performed with an almost clumsy eagerness, betraying the deep-seated awkwardness he felt interacting with others after decades of self-imposed exile. His initial attempts to hand back presents were stiff, his green fingers fumbling with the brightly wrapped boxes, a stark contrast to the smooth, practiced motions of theft he exhibited hours earlier. He was attempting to mimic the kindness he had witnessed, but the motions were derivative, not yet internalized. Max, finally relieved of the reindeer harness, shadowed his master closely, his tail offering tentative, uncertain wags. The dog's silent loyalty during the entire ordeal was perhaps the most consistent representation of unconditional love in the entire narrative, providing a stable emotional baseline against the Grinch's volatile mood swings. Max seemed to understand before his master did that the true burden wasn't the sleigh, but the weight of the Grinch's own resentment. When Cindy Lou Who approached him, her small stature emphasizing the vastness of the emotional gap he had just crossed, her embrace was entirely without judgment. This physical acceptance seemed to short-circuit the Grinch's remaining defenses. He stood rigid for a moment, unused to the simple, unearned warmth, before tentatively returning the gesture. It was in that moment, amidst the restored decorations and the smell of cinnamon and pine, that the Grinch's transformation felt complete. Less like a sudden miracle, and more like the final necessary step in a long, painful confrontation with his own damaged psyche. The townspeople, guided by the benevolent example set by their youngest resident, understood instinctively that true recovery required inclusion, not punishment. They saw not the failed thief, but the shuddering, newly sincere figure standing before them. Mayor Mayhew, whose attempts to regain control over the celebration were swiftly dismissed by the sheer force of genuine goodwill, faded into the background, his materialism rendered utterly irrelevant by the Who's reaffirmed priorities. The ensuing feast was a powerful visual of integration. The Grinch, perched somewhat tentatively at the table, tentatively tasted the roast beast, the very symbol of the feast he had tried to destroy. His initial bites were cautious, but they gave way to a true savoring, suggesting that the simple pleasures of community sustenance were infinitely more gratifying than the isolated gratification of malice. His laughter, when it finally erupted, was rough, unused, and profoundly authentic, a sound that echoed the thawing and expansion of the heart that had defined his entire journey up and down Mount Crumpet. He had sought to destroy Christmas joy. Instead, he found himself enveloped by it, finally realizing that the holiday's resilience lay not in its material trappings, but in the shared vulnerability of those who celebrated it. The integration of the Grinch into the daily rhythm of Whoville was not instantaneous or without its moments of profound awkwardness, a testament to the depth of his former isolation. While the initial rush of forgiveness had swept him into the celebration, the practicalities of daily life in close proximity to so many cheerful beings presented new, subtle challenges. His cavern on Mount Crumpet, though now unused for nefarious purposes, remained a potent symbol of his past, and the Who's, in their burgeoning acceptance, treaded lightly around the question of where he would permanently reside. The Grinch, in turn, exhibited a curious blend of self-consciousness and burgeoning responsibility. He started small, volunteering Max to assist in the town's sanitation, a task that allowed him to observe the Who's without being the absolute center of attention. Max, thriving in the positive reinforcement, became an unlikely town fixture, his previously downtrodden demeanor replaced by an energetic bounce that mirrored the general uptick in Whoville's morale. One particular detail that underscored the Grinch's commitment was his interaction with the town's crafting supplies. Inspired by the sheer, overwhelming volume of artistic effort the Who's poured into their decorations, the Grinch, utilizing his innate dexterity, the same precision he applied to designing his heist machine, began crafting small, intricate gifts. These were not grand, showy things, but rather small wooden carvings of surprisingly elegant design, featuring motifs of nature rather than garish holiday excess. He would leave these gifts anonymously on doorsteps, a silent offering that spoke volumes about his evolving internal dialogue. He was learning to give without the expectation of applause, a concept antithetical to the ego-driven motivations of Mayor Mayhew. The change in the Grinch also had a subtle but perceptible effect on the town's general outlook. Before, the Who's Christmas cheer, while genuine, had bordered on the manic, almost fragile, in its dependence on external perfection. Now, witnessing the tangible redemption of the Grinch, a creature who embodied the very worst of cynicism, gave their joy a new layer of depth. It was no longer merely excitement, it was resilience validated. They understood, more profoundly than before, that the spirit of Christmas was not immune to attack, but it was capable of absorbing and transforming that attack into something stronger. The memory of the empty morning served not as a scar, but as a benchmark against which their current, shared happiness could be truly measured. The Grinch, the reluctant catalyst, had inadvertently taught Whoville the true meaning of enduring faith in one another. The shared experience, the collective relief following the Grinch's return, forged an unspoken agreement within Whoville. The past would be acknowledged but not dwelled upon, allowing the future to flourish unburdened by old grievances. The Grinch, while slowly integrating, still possessed a certain jagged quality, an inability to fully smooth out the rough edges acquired during his long solitude. His initial attempts at socializing often resulted in accidentally frightening small children with his sudden, overly enthusiastic laughter or misinterpreting a friendly gesture as a prelude to ridicule. These moments, however, were met not with the sharp rebukes of the past, but with patient, often amused tolerance from the épouse, Cindy Lou, who became his unofficial ambassador. She treated his awkwardness with the same simple, unforced kindness she had first shown him on the mountain. She never pushed him into large gatherings, instead inviting him to share quiet moments, like helping her water the small, hardy winter flowers that survived the snow. It was in these small, controlled environments that the Grinch began to articulate his feelings, not in grand pronouncements, but in hesitant, low murmurs, directed more to Max than to the listener. He spoke about the sting of his childhood scar, the way the sound of their singing used it to feel like a physical assault on his self-imposed armor, turning his self-hatred into active hostility. Even Mayor Mayhew, despite his bruised ego, found his influence waning. His public displays of holiday cheer now seemed hollow and rehearsed when juxtaposed against the Grinch's raw, earned sincerity. The townspeople began to politely sidestep the mayor's pronouncements, preferring the quiet, observant presence of the newly reformed green resident. Mayhew represented the superficiality the Whos had nearly lost everything for. The Grinch represented the hard-won truth they had rediscovered. The most telling sign of the Grinch's complete transformation came during the traditional lighting of the great town tree. After the initial shock of his return, the Whos had given him the honor of doing the honors. He approached the mechanism with his old meticulousness, but this time his focus was on creation, not destruction. As his hand hovered over the switch, he paused, not out of malice, but out of a sudden, overwhelming sense of responsibility for the beauty he was about to unleash. When the tree burst into light, the resulting collective gasp of awe caused the Grinch to actually smile, a full, unforced, ear-to-ear grin that crinkled the skin around his eyes in a way that was entirely new. It was a smile that belonged entirely to the community, reflecting their joy back at them, finally free from the corrosive bitterness of envy. His life was no longer defined by what he lacked, but by what he was now a part of. The Grinch's integration into the shared life of Whoville inevitably led to a confrontation with his former dwelling. Mount Crumpet, once his fortress of solitude and spite, now felt like a monument to a life he could barely recall. The cavern, with its crude mechanical relics and dusty blueprints for disaster, was too stark, too empty to accommodate the burgeoning warmth that now resided within him. It was Cindy Lou who, with her persistent, gentle curiosity, who indirectly prompted the move. She often wondered aloud, in the presence of the Grinch, about the difficulty of making the climb every evening, especially as the winter snows deepened. The decision to abandon the mountain was gradual, marked by the slow removal of his belongings. Most importantly, Max, who enjoyed the return to ground level immensely. The Grinch's possessions were surprisingly few, consisting mainly of salvaged junk, tools, and a few pathetic mementos of his painful youth that he now viewed with detached sadness rather than searing anger. When the cows finally offered him lodging in the heart of the town, a small, cozy cottage near the square that had belonged to an elderly who had recently moved to be closer to family, the Grinch accepted with a quiet humility that stunned even the most optimistic observers. His new cottage was modest, a canvas upon which he could project his newfound interests. He found immediate fascination with the concept of shared infrastructure. He began quietly observing the town's maintenance schedules, and his specialized knowledge of structural integrity, once used to devise ways to pull houses apart, was now repurposed. He took it upon himself to reinforce the foundations of older Whoville homes, working late at night, not in disguise, but in simple, utilitarian clothing, often with Max resting faithfully beside him. The Whos learned quickly that the best way to thank him was not with fanfare, but with a warm mug of spiced cider left silently on his doorstep. Mayor Mayhew, finding his usual avenues of influence utterly dried up, attempted one last gambit to reclaim relevance. He organized a competition for the most enthusiastic Christmas decorator, hoping to draw the Grinch out into a public challenge where his lack of traditional festive zeal might expose him as an outsider. The Grinch, however, treated the competition with utter disdain, not out of malice, but true indifference to competitive display. Instead of decorating his new home, he simply filled the front window with a massive, glowing crystal he had fashioned himself, a single, pure source of light that needed no tinsel or fluff. It drew more genuine admiration than any of Mayhew's flashing, overdone displays, effectively winning the unofficial contest through sheer, minimalist sincerity. The Grinch's evolution was teaching Whoville that true holiday spirit could be found in introspection and quiet contribution, not just loud proclamation. The Grinch's transition from mountain recluse to town resident brought forth an entirely new spectrum of emotional nuance. His prior actions had been fueled by overwhelming, externalized rage. Now, he wrestled with the quieter, more insidious demons of self-doubt and the fear of relapse. Every time a Who offered him a compliment on his carpentry or his surprisingly insightful critique of a local knitting pattern, a flicker of the old suspicion would cross his face, momentarily freezing his expression before Cindy Lou's reassuring presence would gently coax him back into the present moment. He was constantly scanning, waiting for the inevitable punchline, the moment when their tolerance would snap and they would reveal the trick. Max, meanwhile, became a furry diplomat. The dog's visible contentment, his plumpness, the sheen on his coat, the relaxed set of his jaw, served as irrefutable evidence to the Grinch that he was no longer in an abusive, codependent relationship, but a partnership based on mutual respect. Max was often seen trotting through the town square, occasionally accepting a biscuit from a passing Who, acting as a furry four-legged endorsement of the Grinch's newfound stability. The relationship with Mayor Mayhew evolved into a low-grade, almost tedious rivalry, fought not with theft, but with passive behavioral opposition. May, who would attempt grand public gestures, loud pronouncements about charity drives, or mandatory festive singing sessions, and the Grinch would respond by simply being quiet, productive, and utterly unimpressed. When Mayhew tried to rally support for a large, expensive public statue commemorating the triumph over the Grinch, the townsfolk politely declined to contribute, citing their collective focus on more practical needs, like ensuring the structural integrity of their eaves, a task the Grinch had privately handled weeks before. Mayhew's power, it turned out, was entirely dependent on the Who's shared fear of loss, a fear the Grinch had successfully eradicated. The genuine artistry displayed in the Grinch's crystal lighting of his window became a permanent feature of Whoville's aesthetic. It symbolized a new appreciation for focused, singular beauty over chaotic accumulation. The Who's, taking inspiration, began to pare down their own decorations, focusing on quality and meaning rather than sheer volume. This environmental shift reflected the internal one. Less noise, more substance. The culmination of the Grinch's emotional journey was perhaps best observed during a simple, unscripted moment on Christmas morning, a year after the theft. He wasn't participating in the boisterous gift exchange. He was sitting alone on his porch, observing the sun rise over the now familiar landscape, Max curled at his feet. A small package was delivered by Cindy Lou, placed carefully on his step. It wasn't extravagant. It was a hand-knitted scarf, slightly uneven in its stitching, a clear indication of a beginner's effort. The Grinch picked it up, feeling the texture of the yarn. He didn't need it. He had several heavy furs salvaged from his mountain days. But he draped it around his neck anyway, feeling the slight itch of the wool, a feeling of connection, an acceptance of imperfection. He looked towards Cindy Lou, and this time, the smile that bloomed on his face required no effort, no staging. It was the soft, contented look of someone who had finally found the place where he belonged, a place secured not by walls, but by shared, imperfect goodwill. The quiet acceptance of the hand-knitted scarf marked the final subtle transition for the Grinch. He was moving beyond simple tolerance from the Who's to genuine reciprocal affection. He started viewing his life not as an isolated narrative punctuated by past slights, but as a continuous thread woven into the vibrant tapestry of Whoville. This integration was most visible in his new routines, particularly his early morning walks with Max, which evolved from covert surveillance to friendly neighborhood strolls. During these walks, the Whos would offer him greetings that were now entirely devoid of hesitation. Children, who once hid behind their parents' legs, would now wave excitedly, recognizing the unmistakable silhouette of the green figure. The Grinch's response had also standardized. A slow, deliberate nod, often accompanied by a small, almost imperceptible upward twitch of the mouth. A gesture he had practiced in front of his polished kettle, mimicking the smiles he'd once observed with disdain. His mechanical aptitude found its highest, most wholesome expression in civic duty. When the deep winter storms threatened to block the crucial supply routes leading into Whoville, the town council, with Mayor Mayhew noticeably silent on the matter, approached the Grinch for consultation. He meticulously analyzed the topography and wind patterns, designing a series of small automated snow-clearing mechanisms powered by redirected stream energy. These devices, elegant in their simplicity and efficiency, were a direct application of the genius he had previously channeled into chaos. The sheer practicality of his solutions silenced any remaining critics. He was demonstrating value beyond mere sentiment. The Whos, recognizing his need for personal space, even in community, began subtly respecting his boundaries. If he was seen sitting alone on the edge of the town square, reading one of the heavy tomes he'd salvaged from his mountain library, they would simply leave a thermos of hot cocoa near him and walk away, understanding that presence did not demand participation. This non-intrusive acceptance was perhaps the most profound gift they could offer, allowing the Grinch the dignity of self-regulation in his social engagement. His past, however, was not entirely erased. It served as a cautionary tale, a shadow that occasionally lent weight to his newfound light. On the anniversary of the Great Theft, there was no grand public ceremony of remembrance. Instead, the Grinch found a single, perfectly carved wooden ornament left on his porch, a miniature version of Max pulling a sleigh, rendered with surprising tenderness. It was a nod to the darkness, acknowledged and integrated into the celebration of the light. He understood then that for the Whos, redemption wasn't about forgetting the villainy, but celebrating the transformation that followed, a testament to the enduring illogical power of holiday spirit to mend the most fractured of souls. The final, most significant measure of the Grinch's transformation manifested in his evolving understanding of Christmas itself, moving beyond the simple realization that it wasn't about gifts to grasping its essential nature as shared, active experience. He began to see the intricate, interconnected network of relationships that fueled Whoville's happiness. The small favors, the mutual reliance, the way one whose joy amplified another's. This was the intangible essence he had tried to eradicate and which now became his most cherished possession. He started experimenting with the town's traditions, injecting his unique, somewhat dry humor into the proceedings without undermining the core sentiment. For instance, during the annual tree decorating ritual, instead of adding an obnoxious, oversized decoration, he contributed a precisely balanced, almost perfectly spherical ornament made of polished dark stone. It didn't flash or glitter, but it provided a grounding visual anchor among the overwhelming sparkle, an aesthetic statement about finding beauty in restraint. The Whos adored it, seeing it as a contribution, not a critique. Mayor Mayhew finally faded into obsolescence, his influence entirely eroded, not by direct confrontation from the Grinch, but by the community's collective pivot towards authenticity. Mayhew's final public appearance was during the midwinter town meeting, where he attempted to propose an overly complicated and fiscally dubious plan for next year's holiday budget. The Whos listened politely, but when the Grinch, who had only come because Max insisted on attending, offered a simple, three-point plan for communal resource sharing that relied on cooperation rather than expenditure, the vote was immediate and unanimous in favor of the green consultant. May, who simply shrugged, offered a weak, perfunctory concession, and quietly left the hall, finally recognizing that his brand of hollow spectacle held no currency here. The ultimate quiet triumph occurred when the Grinch no longer felt the need to be thanked or included, but simply was present. One crisp afternoon, while sitting on his porch, carving a new, incredibly detailed wooden bird for Cindy Lou Who, he noticed a small gathering forming near the town well. It was not a structured event, just Who's talking, laughing, sharing a pot of warm punch. He watched them, not with longing, but with the calm observation of someone watching a beautiful, self-sustaining ecosystem. After a moment, he picked up his work and walked over. He didn't announce his arrival. He simply stood near the edge of the group, and after a few seconds, someone offered him a mug of punch without a word. He took it, nodded his thanks, and continued his carving, occasionally offering a low, thoughtful comment on the weather or the strength of the ice. He was no longer the Grinch stealing Christmas. He was a vital, albeit slightly unconventional, part of the Whoville Christmas itself, his redeemed heart beating steadily, synchronized with the joyous, enduring life of the town below Mount Crumpet. The culmination of the Grinch's integration was subtly reflected in his physical appearance. The coarse, wiry fur, once matted with the grime of neglect and mountain solitude, now possessed a noticeable sheen, an echo of Max's well-kept coat. The sharp, angular tension that had permanently etched itself around his eyes and mouth had softened. The deep frown lines remained faintly etched, but they were now often framed by the upward curve of a genuine, albeit still infrequent, smile. He had begun to cultivate habits entirely unrelated to cynical scheming. He took meticulous care of his small garden patch near the cottage, coaxing hardy winter vegetables from the reluctantly thawing soil, discovering a satisfaction in nurturing life that mirrored the nurturing he was now receiving. His relationship with food also shifted dramatically. Gone was the reliance on canned, highly preserved sustenance. The consumption of the roast beast during that first redemptive Christmas had been a shock to his system, but now he actively sought out the local delicacies, favoring the slightly bitter, earthy taste of root vegetables over the sugary confections the Whos typically enjoyed. He was learning the palate of contentment, which favored substance over fleeting sweetness. This transformation culminated in a quiet, unofficial ceremony, marking the end of his hermit status. On the cusp of the next winter solstice, the Grinch decided to finally dismantle the final vestiges of his old life on Mount Crumpet. He went up one last time, not to steal or scheme, but to clean. He methodically packed away the remaining junk, ensuring his presence would leave no lasting mark of malice. As he stood at the precipice overlooking Whoville, now twinkling with its own, more measured lights, he felt a profound sense of closure. He didn't toss anything. He took everything he needed, his tools, his books, and a smooth gray stone he had once used as a paperweight for his eviction notices against Joy, and descended. When he reached the town square, he was met by a crowd, but this time there was no applause, no elaborate welcoming committee. They simply parted to let him through, a silent acknowledgement of his return home. He walked directly to the center of the square, where the great tree stood, and gently placed the heavy dark stone he had carried down beside its base. It wasn't a decoration, it was a foundation stone, an anchor for the community, symbolizing the strength that comes from having confronted and overcome darkness. The Whos understood the gesture implicitly. It meant, I'm here, rooted, and I will help hold things steady. The Grinch looked at the assembled faces, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to check their expressions for deceit. He simply belonged, a green, slightly eccentric, and entirely necessary component of Whoville's enduring, hard-won holiday spirit. The acceptance of the foundation stone marked the Grinch's final complete immersion into the communal identity of Whoville, elevating him from a guest under probation to an essential, if idiosyncratic, citizen. His presence stabilized the town in a way no previous structure or tradition ever had, precisely because his history provided the necessary contrast to their inherent optimism. He was the living embodiment of what they had survived, ensuring their cheer remained grounded in appreciation rather than naivete. His skill set, once a terror, became the town's unexpected asset. He discovered a particular affinity for early winter mechanics, taking charge of keeping the complicated gears of the town's central clock running smoothly, a task requiring precision, patience, and an understanding of how small failures could cascade into significant disruptions. He worked on the clock in full view of the town, often with Max perched on a nearby stool, observing the intricate movements with Maya's quiet intensity. The Who's learned that if the clock struck the hour with its usual melodic chime, the Grinch was content. If it was silent for too long, they knew he was wrestling with a particularly stubborn cog, and they would leave him offerings of specialized lubricants and small, oddly shaped wrenches that he surprisingly preferred over commercially available tools. The dynamic with Cindy Lou, who also reached a peaceful equilibrium. She matured gracefully, no longer needing to be his relentless champion. Instead, their relationship settled into one of shared, quiet mentorship across generations. She would occasionally bring him her own fledgling sketches of holiday concepts, often involving flying reindeer designs that were anatomically dubious. And the Grinch, instead of scoffing, would offer measured constructive criticism on aerodynamics and load-bearing structures. He was teaching her how to dream with physics in mind, and she, in turn, was subtly teaching him the gentle rhythm of unconditional, non-transactional affection. Even Mayor Mayhew, after a year of professional irrelevance, experienced a minor internal thaw. Realizing his power base was entirely dependent on manufactured crisis, and seeing the Grinch effortlessly maintain civic harmony through competence, Mayhew began to scale back his bombastic pronouncements. He didn't embrace altruism, but he adopted pragmatism. He was last seen assisting the Grinch by meticulously sorting discarded scrap metal by alloy type, a task that suited his need for order without demanding public charisma. It was the first truly useful thing he had done in years, a small concession to the new reality where service trumped spectacle. As the next Christmas approached, the anticipation in Whoville was different. It was less about the frenzy of acquisition and more about the quiet anticipation of shared ritual. When the time came for the tree lighting, the Grinch was invited, not as a guest of honor, but as a fellow participant. He stood near the base, his hand resting casually on the cool stone foundation marker. When the signal was given, he didn't touch the switch. Instead, he watched as Cindy Lou Who, guided by the simple nod from the Grinch, illuminated the tree. As the lights blazed forth, the Grinch didn't just smile. He exhaled, a long, slow release of all the tension that had been his constant companion for decades. He was no longer defined by the absence of joy, but by the quiet, sturdy presence of belonging, forever a part of the vibrant, snow-dusted tapestry of Whoville. The 2000 adaptation of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, directed by Ron Howard, presents a vibrant, if sometimes overwrought, exploration of consumerism, isolation, and the elusive nature of genuine holiday spirit. Jim Carrey's interpretation of the titular Grinch is central to the film's success and its inherent contradictions. Carrey, fresh off his early career, success is built on physical comedy and manic energy in films like Ace Ventura. Pet Detective and The Mask brings an almost grotesque elasticity to the character. His performance is less about nuanced bitterness and more about spectacular, over-the-top angst, perfectly suited for the heightened storybook reality Howard constructs. The film deliberately leans into the inherent darkness of Dr. Seuss's original concept, that of an outsider actively attempting to negate communal joy, but softens the edges considerably for a mass audience. The visual design of Whoville is a crucial element here. It's rendered as a saccharine, almost aggressively cheerful environment, drenched in pastel colors and relentlessly focused on material acquisition. This aesthetic choice serves as the perfect foil for the Grinch's drab, garbage-strewn domain atop Mount Crumpet. The constant, almost militant cheerfulness of the Yichus, particularly in their obsession with the annual present exchange, positions them less as innocent celebrants and more as participants in a capitalist ritual. This societal pressure is what fuels the Grinch's resentment. Cindy Lou Who, played by Taylor Momsen, functions as the film's moral compass, though her characterization often treads the line between endearing and precociously disruptive. Her motivations are rooted in a simple, almost naive desire for connection. Specifically, she wants to meet Santa Claus, embodying a belief system untainted by cynicism. Her famous encounter with the Grinch, where she offers him a sugary confection, is the film's pivotal moment of attempted reconciliation. It is a deliberate attempt by the narrative to bridge the chasm between the isolated cynic and the embracing community, using an act of simple kindness rather than grand pronouncements. The narrative structure heavily borrows from the conventional Hollywood redemption arc. The Grinch is not merely misunderstood. He is actively victimized by the superficiality of Whoville's childhood. The flashback sequences detailing his traumatic childhood, his mistreatment due to his appearance, and his ill-fated gift-giving attempt are essential for justifying his later actions. These scenes transform him from a purely malevolent entity into a tragic figure whose cruelty is a defense mechanism forged by social rejection. This addition, largely absent from the original text, anchors the fantastical plot in recognizable psychological pain, providing the necessary emotional weight for the third act transformation. Carrey's physical commitment to the role is staggering. The makeup, while iconic, restricts some of his usual expressive range, forcing him to convey emotion primarily through vocal modulation and exaggerated body language. His Stealing Christmas montage is the cinematic climax of his character arc, a chaotic display of destructive energy that is simultaneously terrifying and hilarious. He is dismantling joy through the methodical removal of its physical manifestations, the lights, the food, the ornaments. The resolution, where the Grinch experiences the realization that Christmas perhaps means a little bit more, is handled with perhaps too much speed. The shift from avarice to altruism is catalyzed not by the Who's embracing him despite his actions, but by his own internal reckoning upon hearing their unbroken singing. This choice maintains the focus squarely on the Grinch's internal journey. The Who's ultimately remain passive recipients of his emotional change. When the Grinch returns the stolen goods and is welcomed back, the community's acceptance feels earned through his sacrifice, his descent down the mountain, rather than through any profound change in their own behavior. The film concludes by reaffirming the triumph of authentic, non-materialistic connection over commercial excess, wrapped neatly in a visually spectacular package that nonetheless celebrates the lavishness of the production design. The emotional resonance of the film hinges heavily on the sheer theatricality of its presentation. Whoville, perpetually lit, as if perpetually noon on Christmas Day, feels less like a real place and more like a stage set designed to amplify the Grinch's alienation. The Who's themselves, from Mayor Augustus Mayhew, whose pomposity embodies the town's materialistic excess, to the background characters obsessed with the size of their ribbons and the sheen of their decorations, serve as living embodiments of the shallow celebration the Grinch despises. They are caricature personified, necessary antagonists for Carrey's equally exaggerated protagonist. The narrative's reliance on sentimentality is most evident in the climax involving the feast preparation. When the Grinch is ready to discard the final remnants of Whoville's bounty, the sound of the Who's singing rises up to meet him. This moment is designed to pierce the Grinch's carefully constructed emotional armor. For a character whose formative trauma revolved around being mocked for his physical appearance and rejected for a heartfelt, albeit clumsy gift, the unbroken spirit of the Who's, even stripped of their possessions, is the ultimate refutation of his worldview. It suggests that joy is intrinsic, not extrinsic. The transition in the Grinch himself is a masterclass in physical acting wrestling with heavy prosthetic makeup. Carrey channels his early inspirations, particularly the physical freedom seen in silent film comedians, but filters it through a lens of deep-seated resentment. When he finally embraces the Who's at the end, his transformation is physically awkward, almost painful, underscoring that genuine change is difficult and requires overcoming ingrained habits of bitterness. His descent down Mount Crumpet in the aftermath of the realization, pulling the massive sleigh full of stolen goods, is a Sisyphean task redeemed by hope. Cindy Lou, whose role as the catalyst remains fascinating because she operates entirely outside the established social hierarchy of Whoville. Her innocence is her superpower. She doesn't seek to critique the consumerism, she simply seeks connection, making her interaction with the Grinch less about holiday ideology and more about basic human empathy. Her small, earnest offering of hot cocoa symbolizes the simple nourishment that the Grinch has actively denied himself for years. The film suggests that the antidote to sophisticated societal pain is often utterly unsophisticated, unguarded love. Furthermore, the film utilizes music, specifically the recurring theme song, to underscore the thematic conflict. While the original Seuss rhyme maintains a consistent, rhythmic comfort, the film's score often swells dramatically, signaling emotional shifts before they are fully earned by the script. This maximalist approach, characteristic of Ron Howard's direction at the time, ensures that the audience feels the moment of redemption powerfully, even if the psychological leap from misanthrope to community member feels slightly rushed by the constraints of a family feature runtime. Ultimately, the film succeeds by making the Grinch's journey visually spectacular and emotionally accessible, sacrificing some subtlety for broad, heartwarming impact, concluding with a satisfying, if slightly conventional, message about the heart outweighing the holiday hustle. The palpable sense of manufactured cheer in Whoville is meticulously crafted to serve the Grinch's narrative purpose. The Whos are not merely celebrating, they are performing their celebration. Their synchronized movements during the lighting of the main tree or the frantic near-military precision of their gift wrapping reveal a community so consumed by the mechanics of the holiday that they risk losing sight of its essence, making the Grinch's critique, however destructive its execution, somewhat founded. This environment perfectly explains the genesis of the Grinch's profound social anxiety. As a young outsider whose physical differences marked him for ridicule, he internalized the Who's judgment, leading him to equate material excess with worthiness, an equation he later seeks to violently disprove. Carrey's commitment to the physical comedy, an inheritance from his days refining his craft in sketch comedy and early cinematic explosions of energy, is vital in preventing the Grinch from becoming purely repellent. Even when smeared with green makeup and adorned with his tattered Santa suit, the audience can track the flicker of genuine wounded feeling beneath the manic scowl. Consider the scene where he attempts to squeeze into his stolen Santa suit, a physical manifestation of the pressure to conform, or conversely, to perfectly mimic the object of his hatred. His movements are angular, jerky, embodying a spirit perpetually out of joint with its surroundings. This is the performance of a man trying to contain an explosion with sheer willpower. Cindy Lou, whose unwavering belief system acts as a delicate counterpoint to the Grinch's aggressive cynicism. Her desire to petition Santa is not about receiving presents. It is an appeal to the highest authority of the season, seeking a blessing that might smooth the rough edges of the world, particularly her parents' distracted absorption in the holiday rush. Her small frame and earnest delivery contrast sharply with the towering, grotesque figure of the Grinch, heightening the visual drama of their confrontations. She represents the possibility of radical, unearned acceptance, a concept foreign to the Grinch's learned transactional worldview where kindness always has a price tag attached. The film's use of flashbacks is perhaps its most significant departure from the source material, transforming the story from a fable about joy theft into a story about healing from childhood trauma. These glimpses into the Grinch's painful past, the mockery over his homemade tie, the awkward rejected gift, provide the necessary emotional scaffolding for the audience to root for his redemption. Without this context, his later change of heart would feel unearned, a mere plot device. Instead, his decision to reverse the theft is framed as a moment where he chooses self-acceptance and empathy over the continuation of the pain that defined his adult life. When he returns the feast, he is not just returning objects, he is relinquishing the heavy burden of his accumulated bitterness, culminating in a physical lightness that mirrors his emotional catharsis. The final scene, where he joins the Who's circle, is depicted not as a complete assimilation, but as a tentative, cherished inclusion, acknowledging that while the heart has changed, the path toward full belonging requires gentle stewardship from the community he once sought to destroy. The transition of the Grinch from villain to embraced community member raises interesting questions about the nature of forgiveness in this constructed holiday universe. Whoville's immediate and total acceptance of the reformed Grinch, evidenced by their joyous welcome when he returns with the stolen goods, speaks to a collective belief in the redemptive power of the holiday spirit, a spirit so potent it instantly erases years of targeted malice. This instantaneous absolution, while emotionally satisfying, sidesteps the necessary complexities of true reconciliation. The film posits that the simple presence of the transformed heart is enough to mend the social fabric. This ease of forgiveness is underpinned by the very nature of the Who's as characters. They are designed to be incapable of holding long-term grudges, their emotional equilibrium inherently geared towards uncomplicated joy. Their focus on the feeling of Christmas, rather than the objects of Christmas, once the objects are returned, allows them to overlook the violation. They are not analyzing the act of theft. They are celebrating the return of the communal spirit reflected in the Grinch's change. This narrative convenience ensures that the uplifting climax remains uncontaminated by lingering resentment or the need for societal restructuring. Furthermore, the film's exploration of the Grinch's relationship with nature, specifically his residence on Mount Crumpet, symbolizes his self-imposed exile. His lair, filled with rudimentary technology used for his scheme, the pulley systems, the rickety sleigh, is a monument to his industrious isolation. He is a meticulous engineer of misery. The contrast between his sophisticated, albeit negative, engineering prowess and the simple organic joy of the Who's celebration emphasizes the film's thematic dichotomy. Calculated artifice versus innate feeling. When he finally descends, leaving the cold, structured solitude of the mountain behind, his physical movement down the slope mirrors the breaking down of his emotional barriers, trading the harsh angles of his isolation for the warm curves of communal acceptance. The entire framework of the 2000 version seems dedicated to providing catharsis not just for the Grinch, but for the audience weary of the season's stresses. By externalizing the materialism and anxiety of Christmas into the character of Mayor Mayhew and the hyper-focused Who's, the film gives the audience a villainous proxy to root against, allowing the Grinch to absorb the necessary criticism. His ultimate victory is not merely in saving Christmas, but in proving that the core emotion, the feeling of togetherness, can survive even its most aggressive assault. A message delivered with the kind of relentless visual energy that marked the peak of Carrey's blockbuster career phase. The inherent artificiality of the Whoville environment, while serving the comedic and thematic contrast, also dictates the nature of the Grinch's ultimate integration. His re-entry into the community is facilitated by the Who's innate capacity for immediate acceptance, which, from a critical standpoint, renders the concept of forgiveness somewhat superfluous. They do not actively forgive. They simply incorporate the anomaly once it aligns with their established festive parameters. When the Grinch carves the roast beast, his physical participation in the feast symbolizes the final act of bridging the gap, not by changing the Who's, but by finally conforming to the basic requirement of communal participation, sharing sustenance and presence. Jim Carrey's physical performance during this final sequence is notably subdued compared to his earlier manic displays. Having shed the intense energy required to fuel the theft, his movements become tentative, almost hesitant, reflecting the vulnerability of someone unaccustomed to genuine warmth. The famous wide-eyed, tentative smile he offers the assembled Who's is a stark departure from the grotesque sneer that defined the first two acts. It is the visual representation of a mask falling away, revealing the softer, wounded feature beneath, a testament to Carrey's ability to anchor even the most outlandish characterization in recognizable human emotion. Cindy Lou Who's role shifts from catalyst to celebratory witness. She sits close to the newly reformed Grinch, her presence acting as a silent endorsement of his transformation. Her hand gently resting near his, a subtle gesture of reassurance, highlights the film's belief that genuine connection requires proximity and touch, elements systematically denied to the Grinch throughout his bitter existence on the mountain. She embodies the idea that sincere, uncalculated affection is the most potent force against isolation. Ron Howard's direction consistently favors visual spectacle over psychological ambiguity. The final feast is rendered with the same lush, detailed extravagance as the theft sequence, ensuring that the emotional payoff matches the preceding visual inflation. The very act of the Grinch eating the roast beast, a symbol of the very materialism he sought to eradicate, is framed not as hypocrisy, but as assimilation. He finally participates in the ritual, thereby validating the ritual itself, albeit redefined by his influence to include an appreciation for the non-material core. The film successfully concludes by arguing that true Christmas spirit is robust enough to weather sabotage and absorb the repentant saboteur, resulting in a slightly richer, albeit structurally conventional, holiday celebration. The structural reliance on the familiar Hollywood redemption template is what ultimately makes the film palatable, despite its excesses in green fur and saccharine sweetness. The narrative deliberately positions the Grinch's trauma, the childhood rejection tied directly to his outward appearance, as the singular root cause of his adult misanthropy. This simplification allows for a clean, cinematic resolution. Had the film lingered on the systemic failures of Whoville to practice tolerance year-round, the redemption would have felt earned through societal change, but instead, the burden rests entirely on the individual act of repentance. The artistic choices made in depicting the Grinch's aesthetic, the impossibly bright green skin, the scraggly black hair, the perpetual shadows under his eyes, were meticulously designed to maximize Carrey's physical comedy potential while emphasizing his otherness. This visual extremism mirrors the extreme emotional states he navigates, from explosive rage during the sleigh loading to the sudden quiet shock when the singing begins. His physical discomfort during the theft, evidenced by the tight squeeze through chimneys and the strain of maneuvering oversized stolen goods, injects a necessary element of slapstick into the malevolence, ensuring the audience remains entertained rather than genuinely terrified. Mayor Augustus Mayhew, in his role as the principal architect of Whoville's superficiality, represents the society the Grinch feels alienated from. Played with a stiff, almost robotic self-importance, Mayhew's character is essentially the personification of the social pressure that crushed the young Grinch. His obsession with presentation, the size of his hat, the perfect symmetry of his town, is the adult manifestation of the very insecurity the Grinch once displayed when offering his poorly crafted gift. His defeat is therefore twofold. The theft is thwarted, and more importantly, the shallow metrics of worthiness he champions are proven meaningless by the sound of the Who's unbroken song. The film's score, particularly the prominent placement of "You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch," repurposed into a darkly comedic anthem for Carrey's performance, functions as an auditory anchor for the character's internal state. When the music shifts to the more gentle piano-driven leitmotif associated with Cindy Lou Who, the audience is immediately cued to anticipate a moment of emotional thawing. These musical cues serve as emotional signposts in a story where the internal psychological shifts are often rapid, compensating for the quick pivot required between the Grinch's destructive zenith and his ultimate heartwarming surrender. The film, through these layered artistic components, constructs a highly controlled emotional experience designed for maximum festive impact. The success of the 2000 film rests significantly on its ability to translate Seuss's deceptively simple rhymes into a fully realized, high-budget cinematic world, a translation that required significant input from its lead actor's established persona. Carrey's background in rapid-fire sketch comedy meant that he brought a level of improvisational chaos to the meticulously planned sets. This inherent tension, the chaos of Carrey versus the rigid order of Whoville, is the engine driving the film's visual narrative. The Grinch is not just an isolated resident. He's an agent of entropy, disrupting a system built on enforced order. The concept of stealing Christmas is dramatized as an act of profound, almost spiritual terrorism against conformity. When the Grinch is shown meticulously measuring the exact circumference of stolen wreaths or cataloging the precise weight of stolen merchandise, it elevates his actions beyond mere vandalism into a perverse form of bureaucratic efficiency. He is using the Who's own obsession with detail and acquisition against them, albeit for negative gain. This meticulousness is what makes his final spontaneous act of returning everything so jarring. It breaks his own self-imposed rules of engagement. Cindy Lou, whose influence is magnified by her role as the audience surrogate, who is permitted to witness the Grinch unfiltered. Her innocent interrogation of the Grinch about the meaning of the season forces him to articulate his pain in ways he normally avoids. Her small voice questioning his massive anger is a recurring motif, the gentle truth piercing the elaborate defense mechanisms of bitterness. This dynamic is crucial because it validates the film's thesis that true kindness does not require intellectual debate. It simply requires proximity and persistence. The character of Martha May Whovier, the Grinch's childhood crush turned superficial adult rival, serves as the ultimate external confirmation of the Grinch's inadequacy in the eyes of Whoville society. She embodies the object of his desire, acceptance, and beauty, which he tragically believes can only be achieved through external validation, material success, or social standing. When she is disappointed by his gifts as a child, it solidifies his belief that his authentic self is unacceptable. Her later shallow attempt to woo him back after his transformation, based solely on his sudden social utility, reinforces the film's critique that surface-level appreciation is worthless. Ultimately, the film provides a reassuring narrative that trauma can be overcome by external acceptance rather than solely through internal therapy. The closing scene with the Grinch joining the Who circle shows him integrated, but still visibly marked by his greenness and his past. He is not made normal. He is accepted as the reformed outsider. This visual juxtaposition, the grotesque, furry figure now participating in the pastel harmony, is the final triumphant image. A maximalist, Hollywood-approved statement that even the most vehement rejection of a community can be instantly healed by the potent, forgiving magic of Christmas sentimentality. The narrative's heavy reliance on visual irony is perhaps most evident in the portrayal of Max, the Grinch's long-suffering dog. Max functions as the Grinch's conscience, a silent, long-suffering foil whose unwavering loyalty contrasts sharply with the Grinch's volatile emotional landscape. Max is often forced into ludicrous costumes, a reindeer, a sleigh puller, which visually underscore the degradation and absurdity of the Grinch's self-imposed mission. His physical exhaustion and resigned size, often captured in close-up by Howard's camera, provide moments of grounding reality amidst the fantastical chaos. Max is the only Who, by proximity, if not by species, who consistently witnesses the Grinch's genuine distress beneath the anger, and his continued presence is an unspoken testament to the possibility of unconditional love, an example the Grinch himself seems unable to emulate until the very end. Furthermore, the thematic preoccupation with sensory overload in Whoville directly informs the Grinch's destructive strategy. He doesn't just steal objects, he steals noise and light. The removal of the sonic elements, the caroling, the festive bells, the general hubbub, is as crucial as the pilfering of the roast beast. This suggests that for the Grinch, Christmas is an aggressive auditory and visual assault, a barrage of forced happiness that drowns out any opportunity for quiet introspection. His success in creating absolute silence on Mount Crumpet, briefly, is his moment of ultimate sensory peace, a vacuum he ironically finds unsustainable once the Hoes begin to sing. The characterization of the young Grinch in the flashbacks, particularly the painful memory of receiving a gift that was clearly not meant for him, or was given with pity, establishes a transactional view of affection. He learned early that gifts and displays were the currency of acceptance in Whoville. When he grows up to steal the gifts, he is enacting a dark, twisted parody of that childhood lesson. If he controls the currency, he controls the social score. The irony, of course, is that the Who singing reveals that the true currency was never material at all, rendering his entire adult life's work moot. The sheer expense and scale of the production design, typical of a major studio production helmed by Ron Howard, ironically underscore the very consumerism the film purports to critique. The elaborate mechanisms of the Grinch's sleigh and the meticulously crafted, gravity-defying architecture of Whoville demonstrate that even the critique of materialism requires a colossal investment in material representation. This creates a layer of meta-commentary. The film is a maximalist celebration of Christmas excess used to deliver a minimalist message about the heart. The visual language is loud, saturated, and demanding of attention, mirroring the very qualities the Grinch struggles against, making his final emotional softening feel like a genuinely hard-won victory against the overwhelming production values of the environment itself. The film's aesthetic choices are not accidental. They are engineered to create a high-stakes emotional arena. Whoville's visual saturation, with its dizzying array of tinsel, ribbons, and impossibly bright lights, functions as a psychological irritant, perfectly justifying the Grinch's extreme reaction. This world is so heavily reliant on external markers of happiness that its very existence seems fragile, dependent on the continuation of consumption. When the Grinch descends, he is not just stealing toys. He is attacking the foundation of their identity, believing that by removing the props, he can expose the hollowness he perceives within. Carrey's performance, while heavily reliant on prosthetics, excels in moments of quiet, wounded observation, particularly when he watches the Who's preparing for their celebration through his high-powered telescope. These moments are rare, fleeting glimpses into the man beneath the monster, suggesting a deep, yearning envy rather than pure hatred. His bitterness is a shield, expertly polished through years of self-isolation. His talent, honed in years of intense physical performance, allows him to convey frustration through minute muscle twitches in his jaw or the unnatural angle of his green fingers grasping a stolen ornament. Details that convey complex emotion despite the heavy makeup. The dynamic between the Grinch and his dog, Max, is crucial for humanizing the antagonist without excusing his actions. Max's palpable suffering, especially when forced to wear the ill-fitting reindeer antlers, evokes immediate sympathy. Max represents the Grinch's last tether to genuine, uncomplicated relationship. He never judges the Grinch's mission. He merely participates out of obligation and residual affection. This relationship operates on a silent contract of need, a bond forged in mutual isolation that prefigures the Grinch's later need for communal inclusion. Max's eventual near-rebellious stance when the Grinch attempts to discard the final Christmas tree symbolizes the breaking point. Even the most loyal follower cannot abide the destruction of the core symbol of joy. The resolution of the conflict hinges on the Who's inability to stop singing, which is presented as a kind of unassailable, almost biological function of their community. This innate joy acts as a force field against cynicism. The Grinch, having meticulously calculated every material variable of the theft, is utterly unprepared for a variable that cannot be stolen or quantified. Intrinsic spirit. His physical reaction to this sound, dropping the tree, clutching his chest, is the moment the narrative truly earns its emotional payoff, transforming him from an actor in a grand farce into a genuine participant in an emotional revelation. The subsequent carving of the roast beast is not just a gesture of peace. It is the Grinch finally engaging in the shared ritual of celebration on his own terms, having purged the material obsession that defined his opposition to Whoville. The theme of chosen versus imposed identity is subtly woven into the fabric of the Grinch's existence. His initial decision to live atop Mount Crumpet can be viewed as an active rejection of the social contract imposed upon him by Whoville's standards of beauty and conformity. He chose isolation as a form of preemptive defense against further rejection. However, the meticulous engineering of his Christmas heist reveals that he has not truly escaped Whoville's value system. He has merely inverted it. He is still operating under the assumption that happiness is quantifiable, and that eliminating the physical objects of joy will eliminate the feeling itself, a direct consequence of his childhood lesson that acceptance was predicated on the perfection of his offerings. The film skillfully uses costume and set design to reinforce this ideological battle. The Grinch's Santa suit, stitched together from scraps and stretched unnaturally over his lean frame, is a mockery, a skin he wears to infiltrate and destroy what he cannot possess genuinely. It's a dark reflection of the ideal Santa Claus figure the Who's worship, a figure Cindy Lou seeks out for genuine blessing. When the Grinch wears the suit, he channels the very authority he despises, demonstrating that even in rebellion, one must use the language of the oppressor. The character of Martha May Whovier operates as a sharp reminder of what the Grinch actively sacrificed for his bitterness. Her adult self embodies the alluring yet empty social approval that eluded him as a child. Her attempts to woo him back after his change of heart are rooted in the same superficiality. Now that he is the center of attention, albeit briefly, as the repentant thief, he holds social currency. This reaffirms for the Grinch and the audience that external validation, regardless of source, is hollow. His rejection of her advances signals his final break from the Whoville value system that defined his pain. Ron Howard ensures that the visual impact of the Grinch's emotional breakthrough is paramount. When the realization dawns that singing persists without the presence, the camera lingers on the Grinch's face, allowing Carrey's mastery of facial contortion to convey an emotional supernova. The shedding of the green makeup and prosthetics at the very end, though brief, functions as a symbolic rebirth, hinting at the person he might have been had he not been scarred by childhood cruelty. He doesn't become conventionally handsome, but his features soften, suggesting that the true monster was the armor he wore, not the features beneath. The final embrace is a testament to the film's belief that sincerity, however late it arrives, is universally recognizable and overwhelmingly powerful. The underlying melancholic tone that pervades the Grinch's narrative, despite the film's ultimately cheerful resolution, is a subtle inheritance from the source material that the 2000 adaptation amplifies through its heightened emotional realism. The Grinch's initial bitterness is framed less as capricious malice, and more as a deeply ingrained response to perceived existential threat. His isolation on Mount Crumpet is not just geographical separation. It is a carefully curated ecosystem designed to minimize exposure to the very emotions, joy, connection, warmth, that cause him psychic pain. This setup allows the film to explore the paradox of forced communal happiness. The very intensity of Whoville's celebration becomes the catalyst for its antithesis in The Grinch. Cindy Lou, whose pure, almost unnerving conviction that everything can be mended through a simple act of goodness is what makes her interactions with the Grinch so dramatically potent. She represents the untapped potential for radical empathy. When she insists on giving the Grinch a gift, a sugary treat, it is a subversion of the transactional nature of Christmas that the Grinch understands. It is an offering without expectation of return, a concept so alien to his hardened cynicism that it momentarily short-circuits his malice. This vulnerability on his part is what opens the door for Max's silent support to transition into active resistance against the final act of destruction. The visual presentation of the Grinch's descent into Whoville for the theft is choreographed with the precision of a military operation, yet imbued with the manic energy of a clown gone rogue. This duality is essential to Carrey's artistry. He makes the act of theft feel both meticulously planned and utterly spontaneous. The logistics of loading the massive amounts of stolen goods onto the overloaded sleigh are depicted with comedic hyperbole, emphasizing the sheer exhausting effort required to maintain a destructive lifestyle. This physical toil contrasts sharply with the effortless, spontaneous joy of the Who's singing, visually establishing the principle that genuine happiness is fundamentally easier than manufactured misery. The film's resolution, where the Grinch's heart grows 3 sizes, is powerfully realized through the immediate physical manifestation of his internal shift. The sensation of his heart expanding is depicted not as a gentle swelling, but as a painful, explosive growth, suggesting that embracing overwhelming positive emotion after years of emotional starvation is physically jarring. This provides a visceral anchor for the audience. The redemption is not easy or passive. It requires a painful internal rupture. His subsequent decision to return the goods is an act of urgent necessity rather than measured contemplation, reinforcing the idea that authentic feeling, once unlocked, demands immediate action to correct past wrongs, completing the emotional arc initiated by Cindy Lou, whose simple, persistent kindness. The narrative structure, in its determined march toward holiday affirmation, consciously bypasses the complex implications of inherited trauma by pivoting sharply toward immediate, visible change. The Grinch's conversion, while emotionally satisfying for the runtime, relies on the notion that a singular, powerful emotional stimulus, the singing, can instantly eradicate decades of learned bitterness and societal conditioning. This highlights the film's preference for fable over psychological depth. The message is that the capacity for joy remains intact, merely suppressed by external forces. The environmental contrast between Mount Crumpet and Whoville is consistently leveraged to underscore this theme. Crumpet is depicted with desolate, jagged rock formations, sharp edges mirroring the Grinch's own rigid worldview, while Whoville pulsates with soft, rounded architecture and an almost unsettling homogeneity of color. When the Grinch finally abandons his mountain hideout, the physical act of sliding down is portrayed as a chaotic, tumbling surrender, a necessary loss of control. He relinquishes the structure and order he imposed on his life, exchanging the predictable cold of isolation for the chaotic warmth of community. Max's role evolves subtly during the descent. After the Hues begin singing, Max's initial tentative steps toward joining the sound betray his own buried instinct for communal belonging, mirroring his master's journey. The dog's subtle head tilt toward the distant music, even while still tethered to the Grinch's destructive sleigh, illustrates that the contagion of joy is not limited to the humanoid population. It is a fundamental resonance that even the Grinch's closest companion cannot resist indefinitely. This subtle rebellion from Max serves as the secondary confirmation that the Grinch's mission is fundamentally unnatural. The climax involving the shared meal further refines the nature of the Grinch's acceptance. When he is offered the first slice of roast beast, it is not a reward for past good behavior, but a necessary component of present belonging. His tentative acceptance of the food signifies his acceptance of the Whovian social ecosystem itself. The act of carving the meat, a skill he demonstrated with near-surgical precision during the theft, is repurposed. He uses his solitary expertise now in service of the collective, proving that his talents, too, can be redeemed and channeled productively within the community framework, thus completing his transformation from an agent of entropy into a functioning, if highly unique, member of Whoville society. The transformation of the Grinch's talent from destruction to construction is the film's most potent piece of symbolic rewriting. His meticulous engineering prowess, so frighteningly deployed in the planning and execution of the theft, the calculating weight distribution of the sleigh, the complex rigging to lighten the load, is immediately redeployed for the feast. This suggests that Whoville is not entirely rejecting the efficiency and detail the Grinch embodies. Rather, they are welcoming the application of that focus toward communal benefit. The Grinch's ability to organize and execute on a massive scale, once feared as the instrument of their undoing, becomes their greatest asset in restoring the celebration. Carrey's portrayal of the Grinch carving the roast beast is marked by an almost religious reverence for the task. His hands, which moments before clumsily fumbled with stolen baubles in panicked anticipation of discovering the true meaning of Christmas, now move with practiced fluid grace over the centerpiece of the feast. This sequence is designed to show that the Grinch's fundamental nature is not malice, but hypercompetence channeled incorrectly. The very act of slicing the meat symbolizes the division and sharing inherent in community, a direct reversal of his earlier impulse to hoard and negate. Cindy Lou, whose continued presence throughout the final scenes acts as a stabilizing force, subtly managing the volatile emotional landscape. She is positioned as the Grinch's personal anchor, ensuring that the adults, caught up in the euphoria of restored tradition, do not accidentally revert to their previous self-absorption. Her small hand reaching out to touch his fur, a gesture of pure, uncalculated contact, contrasts with the rigid social distance maintained by the other Whos in their initial panic. She demands authenticity through proximity, and the Grinch, for the first time, permits it without flinching. The film ultimately delivers a deeply comforting, if psychologically shallow, message that even the most profound isolation is merely a temporary error in calculation, correctable through a critical mass of unconditional positive regard. The speed of the Who's forgiveness is a fantasy tailored for the anxious modern viewer, a promise that the effort required for real reconciliation is unnecessary if one simply believes hard enough. The Grinch's integration is sealed not through a long period of penance, but through the instant validation offered by the shared meal and the final communal song, suggesting that in the world of Whoville, the heart's true size is immediately recognized and celebrated, regardless of the years spent trying to shrink it down to nothing. The concluding visual of the Grinch finally sitting among the Whos, his large, furry green form nestled awkwardly yet accepted within their neat rows of pastel attire, reinforces the film's overarching commitment to maximalist, visually arresting resolution. He is not subtly assimilated. His presence is an undeniable, brightly colored testament to the power of holiday sentimentality to absorb even the most glaring social anomaly. The camera often frames him slightly off-center or slightly too large for the table, acknowledging his persistent otherness even as he participates fully, suggesting that true community integration requires acknowledging the scar, not erasing it. The transformation of the Grinch's wardrobe is equally significant. The tattered, crude Santa suit, the uniform of his attempted negation, is discarded. In its place, he is depicted in simple, perhaps slightly ill-fitting Whovian attire, a plain sweater or tunic, which symbolizes not a complete erasure of his identity, but a respectful modification to fit the communal context. This subtle wardrobe change suggests that while his heart has changed, his unique history remains visible, a curated uniqueness deemed permissible by the now broadened scope of Who acceptance. Even Max receives a form of quiet rehabilitation. Freed from the harness and the absurd antlers, Max sits calmly beside the Grinch, often resting his head near his master's knee. This depiction suggests that Max's own loyalty is rewarded not with grand fanfare, but with the simple peace of stability. The dog's quiet contentment acts as a secondary, non-verbal confirmation of the Grinch's sincere reformation. If Max, the perpetual victim of the Grinch's schemes, is at ease, the transformation must be genuine and lasting. Ultimately, the entire narrative arc functions as an elaborate, visually extravagant demonstration of holiday cognitive dissonance resolution. The film argues that the feeling of Christmas is so inherently powerful and true that it can instantly override evidence of past malice, broken trust, and deep-seated psychological damage. The audience leaves with the comforting illusion that complex human failings, envy, bitterness, the desire for revenge, are merely costumes that can be shed with a sudden surge of collective goodwill, leaving behind only the simple, singing core of the true spirit, perfectly encapsulated in the final, joyous, and slightly overwhelming image of the reformed Grinch finding his place at the table. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Watcher's Desk channel. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like if you enjoy the content. Today, we're going to be discussing the movie How the Grinch Stole Christmas from the year 2000. The small, snow-dusted town of Whoville, nestled snugly beneath the formidable Mount Crumpet, was utterly saturated in the effervescent spirit of Christmas. Their joy, a tangible force that seemed to vibrate in the very air, was an anomaly to the creature who observed it all with simmering disdain: the Grinch. Jim Carrey, whose physical comedy prowess honed in everything from Ace Ventura to The Mask, was perfectly suited for the contorted expressions of the cynical green protagonist, embodied this ultimate holiday hater. The Grinch, burdened by a past trauma, a youthful rejection stemming from his monstrous appearance that led him to flee human society, had cultivated a deep-seated resentment for the Who's relentless cheerfulness, and specifically, their clamorous celebrations. His life, isolated in his cavernous lair, was one of meticulous solitude, shared only with his loyal, if somewhat naive, dog, Max. Max, often the visual anchor of the Grinch's internal conflict, bore the brunt of his master's schemes. The catalyst for the Grinch's ultimate outrageous plan was Cindy Lou Who. This pint-sized dynamo, played by Taylor Momsen, possessed an innocent, almost ethereal belief in the true meaning of Christmas, a concept utterly foreign to the Grinch. Cindy Lou, catching the attention of the town's mayor, Augustus Mayhew, a man whose inflated ego mirrored his girth and who represented the worst of Whoville's materialistic excess, actually managed to glimpse the Grinch high on the mountain, prompting the creature's first real encounter with genuine, unvarnished kindness. This single act of goodwill only hardened the Grinch's resolve. He decided with theatrical fervor that if he could not find peace from their joy, he would simply eliminate the source. He would steal Christmas. The preparations were elaborate, demonstrating the Grinch's perverse, almost artistic commitment to villainy. He fashioned crude contraptions from salvaged materials, sketching out detailed blueprints that spoke to a mind capable of great focus, albeit directed toward malice. Utilizing Max, whom he comically fitted with a makeshift reindeer harness, a visual callback to classic holiday parodies, the Grinch descended upon Whoville on Christmas Eve. His transformation into a Santa Claus facsimile was as much a costume as it was a disguise, his performance mirroring the exaggerated enthusiasm he despised in others. What followed was a systematic, yet almost whimsical heist. He didn't just take presents. He took every single decoration, every garland, every last crumb of roast beast. The methodical nature of the theft suggested a choreographer directing a vast, silent ballet of disappearance. As he hauled his massive sacks of stolen goods up the slope, the anticipation of their ensuing misery was his only fuel. However, as the sun began to rise over Whoville, the Grinch anticipated the ensuing despair, the weeping, the wailing. Instead, a sound drifted up the mountain that stopped his calculated triumph dead in its tracks. It was singing. The Whos, despite waking up to an empty space where their holiday should have been, were gathered together, holding hands, their voices weaving a tapestry of enduring spirit. Cindy Lou Who's earlier encounter had somehow permeated the town's collective consciousness, revealing that Christmas, for them, was not about the stuff under the tree, but the connection between them. This realization struck the Grinch with the force of revelation. The heavy, icy ball that had long resided in his chest began tentatively to thaw. His own heart, once described as 2 sizes too small, visibly expanded. In an almost instantaneous reversal of his entire character arc, the Grinch abandoned his loot and rushed back down the mountain. The return journey was marked by an exhilarating rush of newfound altruism. He returned the gifts, mended the stolen decorations, and, most importantly, accepted the Who's genuine invitation. His appearance at the town square, stripped of his stolen facade, was met not with fear, but with open arms, spearheaded by Cindy Lou, whose unwavering